As an ancient Greek philosopher, Epictetus once said, "We have 2 ears and one mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." But when we are called upon to speak, how do we ensure that our voice truly matters? How do we communicate with confidence, clarity, and impact? In the whirlwind of words and ideas, today's guest on Let's Talk Podcast stands as a beacon, a man who dedicated his life helping others find their voice, hone their message, and speak without fear. A passionate educator, innovative coach, successful business leader, respected academic, Matt Abrahams. In the halls of Stanford, he lectures on organization behavior in the world of publishing. He's the author of an empowering book, Speaking Up Without Freaking Out. And recently, it's available for pre-order, Think Faster, Talk Smarter. One of the Matt's core philosophies, which I have learned from his mother, is to tell the time, not build the clock. And this speaks volume about the gift of making the complex simple, a skill that undoubtedly contributed to his being awarded like some of these awards like Rising Stars, Circle of Excellence, so on and so forth. And because of this relentless curiosity and willingness to ask questions, his commitment to his mission are reflected in his podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart, and in his curation of his website, nofreakingspeaking.com. So as we dive today's conversation, remember, public speaking is not about perfection. It's about connection. And who else better than Matt Abrahams would kind of give us some perspective. So Matt Abrahams, welcome to the show. It's been a privilege.
Thank you so much. What a kind introduction. And I have never been introduced going all the way back to the ancient philosophers as a way to be introduced. But thank you.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. And first of all, I would try to kind of give you a perspective. I'm a big fan of your communication styles. I'm learning as well. And even to the point that the three things which you always educate and mention to the people about what, so what, and how what, I have even incorporated in my LinkedIn profile. So just to bring some structure
Wow.
to make sure, and this is really helpful in all admission within my organization as well, that how do I structure sending an email to my clients talking about some projects, what is the outcome which we are looking for, what is the way, and why we are doing that. So Matt, thank you so much for providing that kind of a guidance.
Absolutely. And you're right on. Structure is so important and you can use it in so many ways, from a LinkedIn profile to an email to the way you communicate. So I love that you're applying that in your own life.
Definitely. So let's get started. You've been a student of psychology and then you get into communication. We have seen a lot of guests having totally unrelated, I would say, background and then get into something which really resonates them. So, how exactly psychology moves to communication? Was it an accident or that was a full, I would say, a premeditated move from your part?
My entire academic career has been just by following my passions and then discovering that there were actually fields that studied this. So when I was very young, it was very clear to me that I was interested in how people communicate, how people influence each other, how people are different. And that spurred a curiosity in me. When I went to college, I went to Stanford as an undergraduate. I didn't know anything about psychology. In fact, I didn't even know, I thought anybody who studied psychology became a therapist. I didn't know there was this other area of psychology. And in a class I took, I was actually on a pre-med path to become a doctor. They brought in some social scientists who spoke to us, and they brought in a psychologist. And I kid you not, within the first 30 seconds of him talking, I became completely enamored, and I literally switched my major that week. I remember actually the first words he started. He started his lecture after being introduced, he said, "The funny thing about common sense is it's not so common." And as soon as he
Right.
said that, I was just enamored. I was just like, "Yes, I believe that. Tell me more." And
Exactly.
and I discovered in psychology communication. I actually studied as an undergraduate with Philip Zimbardo. Phil Zimbardo is very famous for or infamous, depending on how you look at it, for the Stanford Prison Experiment, a fascinating but also diabolical study. But what many people don't know about him is he also studied shyness. He actually opened the very first shyness clinics in the Western United States. And so, shyness obviously is clearly related to communication, related to anxiety and confidence in communication, things that I was interested in. So, I began working with him. So, I sort of fell into what I studied, but the passion for it has been with me as long as I can remember.
Exactly. That's a great, I would say, a segue to have a question around what do you suggest to the people? So you mentioned that sometimes you stumble upon these opportunities, and including me, a lot of people in the past struggle about what do I do next? Or maybe that person was fortunate enough to stumble upon, but I'm not fortunate. Do I just be in a parking lot, or how do I find my calling? So, what's your perspective based on your experience?
Well, I only have my experience to reflect on. So I live my life by two principles. One is try to stay open to as many opportunities as possible. So when you can, reduce restricting possibilities. And two, be willing to say yes. I have been saying yes in my career and in my personal life for a long, long time, way before I learned anything about improvisation, where yes and is a powerful tool, and I believe in it fully. So for me, where I in my life have had key choices, I have often challenged myself to opt for the choice that leads to more opportunities, or conversely, shuts down fewer opportunities. So I'll give you an example. When I graduated high school, I had thought that I always wanted to be a movie director. One of the ways I was always fascinated about how people communicated was through images and movies and pictures. And I actually got into a film school. And my choice was go to film school or go to another university. I chose to go to Stanford primarily because I felt there were more options and opportunities. Had I gone to film school, I would have been locked into what I felt at the time and believe today would have been fewer opportunities. So, to anybody who is feeling stuck or looking to pivot or trying to find whatever their passion is, look for the path of most opportunities and stay open to those opportunities by saying yes. Now, that's not reckless. You don't say yes to everything, but at least consider saying yes more than many of us. Many of us are risk averse, especially when it comes to career ideas. So that's what's worked for me and hopefully can work for others.
Absolutely, I think that perfectly makes sense. Initially, you really have to keep your, I would say, ears open, be curious, listen to each and everything going around. As we always say that when you try to seek a knowledge, the world is your library. So you really try to look into those things which you always have done in the past. And I always mention that I do as a side business a real estate investing. When I was not, I didn't see for sale signs. Now I see literally everywhere.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that really helps to create the opportunities. And then, as you mentioned, and then you'll start using try to carve those opportunities and maybe start communicating. So now the next part is okay, I got what I'm looking for. Now I have to communicate.
Hmm.
Now, what are the fundamentals? You mentioned about structuring. You mentioned about public speaking, and I always encourage everyone to please go to Matt's podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart, and try to learn all those goodness. But if there are three things, what exactly would that be? Okay, let I have to be a good communicator, and it's a struggle. I mean, it's always learning. So, what do you think about that?
So there are many, many things we can work on. If you said I had to pick three, they would be, and in this order, they would be: first, build confidence. There are things we can do to help us manage the anxiety and the lack of confidence we can often feel in high stakes communication situations. So that's number one. Number two is focus on your audience, understand them, create content that resonates and is salient for your audience. And then three, as we mentioned, or I mentioned slightly earlier, this notion of structure, having a structure to package up what it is you say and actually to help you think more clearly about your content. So those would be the three. Start with anxiety, focus on your audience, structure your content. There are many more I could add to that list, but I think those would be the top three that I believe. And across all of the interviews I've done on my podcast, where we focus only on communication, I would say those are the ones that come up most frequently.
That's great. Do you feel, I would say, feel anxiety, or you are totally above that now?
I don't think anybody ever truly can be above anxiety. I have certainly over the years learned to manage my anxiety much better than I did when I was younger. I was a fearful speaker very early in my life and learned through techniques and through research I did and books I've written, conversations I've had, to be much less nervous. I'll tell you, every year there's one circumstance that will always get me nervous. There is a gathering of people who do what I do, people who teach communication skills at top business schools. We get together every year and we share best practices. It's a wonderful group of people. And sometimes I'm asked to present. And I'll tell you, I get really nervous in front of that group. And there are things I do to help manage that anxiety, certainly. But for me, when I'm in front of my peers, people who know as much or more than I do, who I respect and have looked up to and read a lot about, I get pretty nervous.
After all, we are humans. I think you rightly mentioned that we have to manage the anxiety rather than try to overcome, because it's there, it's just like in different proportions. And I think that reminds me about my journey from podcasts as well. I have never, I mean, apart from my office calls, I never enabled my camera and then try to talk like that. And I was like, let's give it a challenge. And a lot of people were surprised when I started this, because there's so
Huh.
much of self-doubt. I grew up in India. I know that I have a lot of grammatical errors also sometimes, so I'm not perfect. But I think the best way to do that is just to put yourself out there and start learning with the folks like you, and try to incorporate those learnings and try to have those continuous journey of, I would say, a good communicator.
Well, I applaud your effort. Taking on a podcast is hard, it's challenging, but it's also wonderfully rewarding, not only for those of us who are hosts, because you get to talk to just really cool people, but also knowing that there are others who are listening and potentially benefiting from what you're saying. So it's a laudable effort, but it can be nerve-wracking and definitely takes a lot of time.
Yes, exactly. So let's talk about the anxiety you mentioned. Different people across the board have different sort of anxieties. Do you have any suggestions about what are maybe some scientifically proven anxiety mitigation steps, which works approximately everyone when they would like to communicate and try to ease their anxiety in that manner?
I love how you said that, easing anxiety. I think that's a really nice way to put it. Again, I don't think we can ever truly overcome all of our anxiety around communication, but we can certainly manage it and make ourselves feel more comfortable. The tricky thing is everybody's different, and our sources of anxiety can be different because our experiences are different, our biology is different. And so there's no one way that can help everybody. That's why the first book I wrote, Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, looks at 50 academically verified techniques, and I'm happy if 3 or 5 of the 50 apply to any one person. But let me share a few that seem to have a broader impact than some of the others. So clearly, one of the best things we can all do is to do some deep belly breaths. If you've ever done yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, it's this deep belly breathing that can actually calm our autonomic nervous system. And I learned from one of my guests that what's most important is not the inhale, it's the exhale. All the magic happens during the exhale. So you want your exhale to be twice as long as your inhale. So if you take a 3 count in, take a 6 count out. So that's perhaps the most important physical thing we can do to address some of our physical symptoms. A mental thing we can do that I like is to refocus our attention. Many of us turn the spotlight inward when we get nervous about speaking, and we think about how we're appearing to others, all of the things that we could say. We're trying to judge, am I saying it the best way I can? And that can just spin you up and make you even more nervous. If you take that spotlight and turn it onto your audience and remind yourself that when you communicate, you are in service of your audience. It's about them, it's not about you. That changes your focus. So you become focused on what can I do to empower my audience? How can I best help them? And by putting the focus there and perhaps the pressure there, it lightens the load on yourself. And so I always ask people to think about the value they bring. In many circumstances, when you're speaking, you've been invited to speak. People want to listen to you in some capacity. Even if you're in a sales role, they're interested in what you're selling. So you have the opportunity to refocus your attention, and that can help a lot.
Absolutely. And I think what you mentioned is that one word is not, it's not about you, it's about them. That really
Yes.
is a lot of anxiety about try to seek what they are looking for. And I heard in one of your podcasts, you also mentioned is when you are blank,
Yeah.
I mean, it's totally natural. Like when you're blank, then maybe you can just take a deep breath and ask a question to the audience so that
Yes.
you can get a breather time. Would you like to kind of expand a bit on that?
Yeah, so the biggest fear people report to me is the fear of blanking out. They can't remember what they want to say in the moment. And there are a couple things to do to prevent this from happening in the first place. One, leverage structure, as we talked about. Structure is a roadmap. If I am doing a presentation using what, so what, now what is the concept I'm talking about, so what is why it's important to my audience, now what is what comes next. If I have planned my presentation, not memorized it, but planned it in that structure, if I get lost at any point, I have my map. So if I finish what, and I'm like, I can't remember what comes next. Well, I remember what is always followed by a now what. So I know where I'm going. So having a structure helps. The other thing that really helps people is to really ask people to think about honestly, how likely are you to forget? And when most people are candid and say, in reality, maybe there's a 20% chance that I'll forget, that's a huge likelihood that you won't forget. That's 80% chance. So one way to mitigate or avoid blanking out is to have a structure and to remind yourself it's not that likely overall. If you do blank out, then the point you were bringing up is absolutely critical. If in the moment I'm speaking and I can't remember what to say, a great thing you can do is ask your audience a question. And by asking them a question, in essence, you distract them from paying attention to us. Because here's what happens. When you blank out, all of a sudden you feel the immense pressure of everybody looking at you, expecting you to say something. So simply distract them. So what I will do when I teach, and occasionally I forget what I want to say next, I'll stop and I'll just say, I want to pause, and I'd like everybody to think about how what we've just discussed can be applied in your next situation. Now, I know I'm fortunate. I'm a teacher. I teach communication. A lot of these questions can be very easy to ask. But I challenge all of your listeners and viewers that they probably can find a question that they can ask. And while the audience is thinking of the answer, you can take that breath, you can look at your notes if you have them, you can take a step back, and then you can get back on track. So there are lots of things we can do to avoid blanking out. And if we do blank out, having a question at the ready that we can ask can be really helpful.
Awesome. So I have one more follow-up question on this because this happens
Sure.
a lot, at least in my profession.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, okay, maybe I'll say, Matt, I understood. Maybe I'll ask a question. Now, what
Uh-huh.
about if I only hear crickets? No,
Well, so you
no,
don't need them. You
yes,
don't need them to answer the question. No, no. This can
yes.
be a rhetorical question,
Okay.
And what I'll do sometimes, and again, this isn't always appropriate. I'm a
Mhm.
teacher, so I have a different opportunity. But what I'll do sometimes is I'll say, I'd like all of you to think about how what we've just discussed could apply to your life, and turn to the person next to you and tell them. So they are totally engaged. But just ask a rhetorical question. You could say, hey, take up one moment to think about how what we've just discussed could change how you do what you normally do. And while everybody's thinking, I can get my spot. If I don't have my spot, I could actually ask somebody. I could say, Saurabh, tell me, how would it impact you? And then I invite you to share. So you can play with it to make it work. I have seen it work in my own life. I've done it many, many times, and others tell me it's very useful as well.
That's great. I totally. I'll try to do it again in that perspective, and not try to seek an answer. And I
Yeah,
think I recall in one of your, I think 8 or 10 years old video in Stanford only. I think you did a few of those things as well, engaging the audience, right? I don't
absolutely.
recall, yeah, what you exactly did, but I recall that there was a part of that.
Mhm. There's a
Yeah.
there's a video of me
Mhm.
it's called it's the namesake of my podcast. If you go to
Mhm.
YouTube and search "Think Fast, Talk Smart," you'll find this talk I did that became many people have watched it. And in it, I use a lot of engagement techniques where I ask the audience to do activities, I ask them questions, I take polls to just get them engaged. I believe it is our job as communicators to engage our audience.
Mhm.
The most precious commodity, to my mind, that we have in the world today is attention. We need to get people's attention, but not just get their attention, we have to sustain it. And the way you sustain attention is through engagement. It's asking questions, it's taking polls, it's using analogies. Anything you can do to keep people's attention so that they can see how what you're saying is important to them.
Exactly. And I also would like to emphasize for all the viewers here is I'm in that kind of a journey where I
Mhm.
know if you have followed Matt has interviewed and been interviewed by a lot of big personalities, and they have a flawless conversations as well. I'm in the journey, so you can see my first episode and this episode and how exactly I'm working through. So if you are in the same boat, you can reach out and definitely we can share some perspective on that. Uh, Matt, regarding as you mentioned about the anxiety, I would like to touch upon how to prepare our kids to be a good communicator. There are a lot of, I don't know if you have touched upon this, because I've seen a lot of communication when you are trying to do certain things in your life. It's not
Mhm.
by default. So, how do we kind of sow that seed pretty early in our life and try to teach kids to be a good communicator? From your perspective, what are maybe like top things you would say that, okay, these are the things you should be doing as a parent to make your kids a good communicator and be successful in life?
So before I answer that question, I just want to applaud the fact that you are actively working on your communication skills and the fact that you go back and listen to or watch your previous podcasts. As painful as that is for most of us
I
to
know.
listen and watch ourselves, it is a wonderful tool. And I
Thank you.
do it as well, and I've been doing it for so long that it doesn't bother me as much, but it's a great way to learn. And I tell everybody, when if you there's any recording you have of yourself communicating, watch it in three different ways. Watch it without listening, listen
Mhm.
without watching, and then combine the two, and you will notice different things, and celebrate the successes, not just fixate on the things you want to fix. So the
That's
fact you're
great.
doing that is great, and part
Thank
of
you.
that answers your next question. I believe everybody can get better at communication, and I think particularly young children can be encouraged to focus on their communication. The fact is, they're communicating all the time. You know, more and more everybody has a device in their hand. It's helping kids to understand the value of good, clear communication. So, a few things I would suggest. One, parents can role model good communication. My wife and I consciously made the choice to have a lot of our inner conversations, the private conversations we would have in public. So when we're deciding where we should go to dinner or where we should take a trip, we try to do that in public, or when our kids were younger, in front of them, so they could see what deliberation, what collaboration, what negotiation looks like. So one thing is we need to take time to model it for our kids. Second, we need to comment on it, both positive and negative. So, for example, if your kid does something well in their communication, pause and say, "Hey, I was really impressed how you explained that to your younger brother. That was really interesting. I never thought of doing it that way." So that they understand that there's value in how we communicate something. Then we need to get them to see more broadly differences and begin to develop appreciation for different ways. So when my kids were younger and people found out what I did, I was often asked in at the elementary schools and even middle schools around our area to give talks, and I love doing that. I taught high school for 2 years, decades ago, so I love working with kids. And what I would do with younger kids is I would say, think about your teachers. I mean, all kids, at least of the ones I was working with, have had multiple teachers. And I'm saying, think about your teachers. Think about something really hard that they taught you. How did they do that? How did they help you learn that? And kids are actually very perceptive. They'll say, oh, they played a game, or they repeated themselves, or they defined words. So all of a sudden, you help the kids understand through an analogy, teaching. They as students, the teachers as communicators, and they begin to see it. So it's about modeling, it's about reinforcing positive communication, and it's about helping kids to begin to understand how communication can be used to help get their points across.
That's a great insight, actually. So, yeah, you have to model, you have to reinforce, and then you have to communicate and ask these questions, as you mentioned, right?
Yes.
To make them aware that the way how I just communicated to my parents really matters, and they're like that. And you can definitely teach I mean, in my case, I have a 7 year and 2 year old. So 7 year old son, he's in that mode right now, and obviously 2 year old daughter, she's too young at this time. But I totally, it makes sense on that. So now we are getting towards the concluding part here in our conversation. I can go on and on because in
So can
communication
I.
there are so many things. Yes. What I would like to know from maybe from your perspective, why you have written this particular book.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I mean, now I'm going blank here. Think
Think
faster,
faster,
talk
talk
smarter.
smarter.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So I'm not that creative with names. No, the new book it leverages a lot of what came from the podcast, and it's
Mhm.
really taking it to the next level. That's why it's called Think Faster, Talk Smarter. So in my many years, decades of coaching, teaching, communication, writing about, podcasting about it, one of the things became very clear. If we do anything to focus on our communication, we tend to fixate on planned, high stakes communication. And it makes sense. Those situations are really important. But we leave out what I believe makes up the vast majority of our communication, which is spontaneous, in the moment communication. You know, very rarely do we plan out everything we want to say. Even this conversation you and I are having, you were very kind. You gave me some parameters. I knew the general things we were going to talk about, but I didn't know the specifics. And I've said things that you've then played off of. Most of our communication in our personal and professional lives is spontaneous. People ask you questions, they ask for feedback, you make a mistake, you have to correct it. All of these are in the moment, spontaneous communication topics. And so this book is all about how to improve your ability to speak in the moment. It's divided into two parts. The first part is all about a methodology that I've honed and developed over many years at Stanford. And then the second part is about specific situations where I give advice and guidance on how to do it. Now, that first part about the methodology identifies 6 specific steps that people can go through and practice. It's not just reading a book and thinking about it. You actually have to do it. The only way you get better at communication is repetition, reflection, and feedback. So you have to do it. You have to think about how it went, and you have to ask others to give you feedback. So the book is designed to help in all 3 of those: repetition, reflection, and feedback.
That's great. I think that's the key: repetition, reflection, and feedback. And in order to get more on this, I would really encourage everyone who is viewing or listening to this podcast to pre-order. At the part of the show notes, we can definitely provide that so that you can go ahead and you can follow Matt Abrahams on LinkedIn and all the other different channels where you would like to. That being said, Matt, thank you so much for providing the time here, talking about some of the key aspects. I really like the way how you provided some guidance in different aspects here. And I really wish you all the best for your future endeavors. And definitely, if I'll be there near Stanford, I'll give you a buzz and we will try to maybe meet. And everyone would be seeing a picture on LinkedIn, I guess.
Would love to host you when you're in the Bay Area. That would be wonderful.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Matt. And
Thank you.
yeah, okay, sure. And before everyone goes, what do you think about this podcast? Do you have any comments? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have a different perspective? What's your experiences? Please provide any kind of a comments, reflections through different kind of mediums or channels you're watching this podcast. And of course, if you subscribe, please subscribe only when it makes you think, which is the philosophy of our podcast. So thank you, everyone. Have a blessed day and a week ahead. Okay, so I think let me just